Welcome back to United Case Report. Today's case is going to require a moment, because before we get into the courtroom, I need to prepare you for the level of cold, calculated behavior you are about to hear. This is a story about grief, or at least, what someone tried to disguise as grief, because what this man actually did, in the months after his wife passed away, was not grieve. It was something else entirely. And when Judge Judy heard the full story, she sat back in her chair and said 4 words. I cannot believe this. Neither could we. Setting the scene. The man at the center of this case, we'll call him Ronald, was 52 years old from Arizona. His wife, Margaret, had passed away after a short but serious illness. They had been married for 19 years. Margaret had 2 adult children from a previous marriage. Let's call them Karen and Stephen. They were not Ronald's biological children, but they had grown up in the household and considered him a stepfather. The relationship was functional, if not deeply warm. Margaret passed in early February. She had a modest estate, a life insurance policy, a joint bank account with Ronald, and 3 credit cards in her name only. Her children were listed as beneficiaries on the life insurance policy. Ronald was the beneficiary on the joint account. What happened in the 6 months after Margaret's death is the subject of this case. When Karen and Stephen began the process of settling their mother's estate, they contacted her credit card companies to close her accounts. That's standard procedure when someone passes. You notify the creditors, close the accounts, and deal with any remaining balance. But when they called, they discovered something. The cards had not been dormant. They had been active, very active. Margaret's 3 credit cards, accounts that were solely in her name, had been used continuously for 6 months after her death. The charges included grocery runs, restaurant meals, gas station purchases, clothing, home improvement supplies, and this one stood out, a weekend stay at a resort in Sedona. Total charges post-death, $14,800. The charges had been made using cards that had been physically in the household at the time of Margaret's death. Cards that Ronald would have had access to. Ronald's name was not on those accounts. He had no legal right to use them. Using a deceased person's credit accounts is fraud. Karen and Stephen reported it to the credit card companies and to the police. They also filed a civil suit against Ronald for the full amount charged, Ronald's defense. Ronald's position was extraordinary. He claimed that he had been in such a deep state of grief following Margaret's death that he had not been thinking clearly. He said he continued to use her cards out of habit, that he was used to having access to her things, and in his fog of grief, he simply did not register that the cards were no longer authorized for his use. 6 months of grief fog, $14,000 of grief fog, including a resort weekend in Sedona. He also argued that as her husband, he had an informal understanding with Margaret that her resources were shared resources and that she would have wanted him to be financially supported during this difficult time. He said this in a courtroom, with 2 of her children sitting across the table from him. In the courtroom, Judge Judy read the credit card statements very carefully. She noted the dates, she noted the nature of the purchases, regular, purposeful, spread across different merchants and different days. These were not chaotic grief purchases. These were a person's normal spending activity. She looked up and said, "You used your deceased wife's credit cards for 6 months." Ronald said, "I was going through an incredibly difficult." Judge Judy said, "The Sedona resort. That was grief?" Ronald said, "I needed to get away. I was struggling." Judge Judy said, "You went to a resort on your dead wife's credit card." Ronald said, "Margaret would have wanted me to." Judge Judy stopped him. She said, Do not tell me what Margaret would have wanted. Margaret is not here. What is here are her credit card statements showing $14,000 in charges made after she could no longer authorize them. By you. In a state of alleged grief that apparently did not prevent you from checking into a Sedona resort. She paused. Then she leaned back and said quietly, almost to herself, I cannot believe this. The verdict: full judgment for Karen and Stephen, jointly, for $14,800. Judge Judy also noted in her ruling that the behavior described constituted financial fraud, and that the civil judgment did not preclude criminal prosecution, which was already underway separately. She said, Your wife spent 19 years building a life with you, and in the 6 months after she left this world, you spent her money. That is not grief. That is exploitation of the dead. Reflection. I want to be clear about something. Grief is real. The disorientation that follows the death of a spouse is real. There are people who make mistakes in the fog of loss, who forget to cancel subscriptions, who inadvertently use an old card, who are simply not functioning properly. That is not what this was. This was 6 months, $14,000, a resort in Sedona, purposeful, regular spending spread across hundreds of individual transactions. This was a man who lost his wife and decided that her death was a financial opportunity. Karen and Stephen collected their judgment. The criminal case resulted in a conviction for credit card fraud. Ronald received probation and a restitution order. Margaret's estate was settled. Her children moved on. Some people grieve. Some people calculate. And the courtroom, eventually, tells the difference. This has been United Case Report. Subscribe for daily cases and comment. What do you think the appropriate punishment for Ronald should have been? We'll see you in the next case.